Today I'm covering the granddaddy of strength, the corpuscular Canadian Louis Cyr, who wowed audiences with his feats of strength in the late 1800s, and many, even today, consider to be the greatest of all time. So we're going to get to the bottom of it. Was Louis Cyr a vaudeville circus performer, literally the greatest man who ever lived? Could he have been world's strongest man? Or is there more to the story? Stay tuned. Now, if you've ever played the game of telephone, you know how the passage of a story from one person to the next either adds completely made up details or loses important ones to fuck with the veracity of the story. It makes the end result absolute nonsense. And when you're Louis Cyr working as one of the most famous and lucrative strongman performers of the late 1800s, bullshit is gonna get added to your origin story like it was a lint roller at a manure factory. Now, Louis' big fish of a life started the second he was born. It was claimed that the man came into the world weighing 18 pounds. Have you ever seen a baby when he gets to be 18 pounds? It's like somebody glued feet on a bowling ball. It's entirely head. Now, Louis had anywhere between 12 and 17 siblings. These margins of error are going to be a theme here. And his dear mom stood 6'1" and 265 pounds. Birthing machine that she was, women were not giving birth to full-size Christmas turkeys and living to tell about it in the late 1800s. But Louis Cyr grew to be a legend of strength and a giant among men. It is perfectly plausible. Now let's not go throwing around the term giant, because Louis, when he topped out, measured at 5'8.5". In the modern era, with 8 times more people on the planet, 15 pounds will make you the biggest baby in China. Now I'm sure Cyr was a big baby, but it was obviously exaggerated, and it was undoubtedly a result of gestational diabetes, not him having some orc-like bloodline. So we're 30 seconds into the man's life, and let's just say that my confidence isn't exactly riding high. The rest of Cyr's legacy is similarly propped up by unreliable sources, multiple tellings of the same story, and a lot of math that just ain't mathin'. Take the story of his first strength contest, which was lifting a horse. Literally, it was just 3 guys at the bar. There's a horse, pick it up. Oh, Louis picked it up. Hurrah! Let's go drink beer and wait for syphilis to kill us. Now you might be curious as to how they actually picked up the horse. That's a pretty important detail. This article clearly says that he hoisted it up by the shoulders, presumably by getting underneath it and squatting the thing up. But whoever wrote this seems to think that they were lifting the horse overhead, which of course they fucking weren't. According to yet another source, there was a handle that was used to make lifting it easier, and I don't know how you deadlift a horse unless it's on a platform and you're standing above it like one of these monstrous contraptions that Rogue spends a lot of money to make. Don't ask so many questions, bro. Lifting a horse is rad. This is just one of many often repeated parts of Louis' origin story that has multiple tellings that vary a lot on really important details. Like one of his most famous lifts, it's one that gives me the greatest amount of hives. Louis Cyr was 19 when he lifted the never yet moved boulder. It happened on the 3rd Sunday of May, 1883 in the backyard of the Suffolk Mills factory in Lowell, Massachusetts. From the ground to the shoulder before a gathering of hundreds. The stone was then moved by 6 men and weighed in at Olivier Gaudet's general store. It was recorded at 517 pounds. Returned to its original spot, it disappeared in 1903. Like the Husafeld and Inver stones have been there for centuries, but a 1/4-ton rock in an era before tractors, we just lost track of it. It's one thing to change details about the way he lifted it or embellish the weight of the thing, but this calls into question whether or not this ever actually happened at all. But to me, the most damning thing is that we just have an absolute fuck ton of examples of bigger, stronger, pharmaceutically enhanced men yanked from a bigger talent pool and put into the crucible of competition. And today, the ones that hoist the biggest stone to get close to this number don't fit the bill of a fat 5'8", 19-year-old with no access to barbells. For instance, this is Mateusz Kielszkowski, who's the closest to looking like the unrealistic action figures I played with as a kid as anyone I've ever seen. And he's a genetic experiment selected for his freakish Japanese horror genre spider build that is specifically useful for picking up big fucking rocks and bringing them up to his shoulder. Everyone on the stage that he is competing against in this clip is more muscular and taller than Louis Cyr ever was. Mateusz blows all of them away in the stone to shoulder by taking this 415 rock to his shoulder 3 times, where most of the field couldn't even do it once. Now compare Mateusz, who's stronger than Louis Cyr in every possible way, including squatting, deadlifting, and pressing, who is built with long arms to wrap around and negotiate awkward objects, and then look at the obese 5'8" teenage lumberjack with arms that are too short to scratch his balls. Yeah, totally, did 100 pounds more than that on a whim. Did it behind his work, actually, with some people watching, and it was such a monumental feat that they misplaced the fucking stone. Like, quite literally, the only reason to believe that Louis Cyr shouldered a 500+ pound stone is because people just often repeat that he did. And if that's all it takes for you to believe something that is so wildly out of step with every bit of evidence we have about human performance, you will literally believe anything. Now, this stone was the inspiration for the Louis Cyr stone, which was made as a replica at Fortissimus in 2010. It's weird that you make a replica about a stone that you don't have access to, you don't know the shape, the dimension, the material. So here it is, a 530-pound stone. They call it the Louis Cyr stone after the stone that Louis definitely did not shoulder, and we get to see 330 pounds of lean American sirloin Derek Poundstone barely get it to the platform, but be the only one to do so, beating Zydrunas Savickas, the inarguable GOAT of Strongman. And to commemorate it, they etched both of their names into the replica stone, which should be, I guess, like an honor for Derek to be positioned next to this legend of strength. But I actually think the opposite. I think it cheapens it because Derek's impressive and very real feat is now bootstrapped to Louis' feat, which we know absolutely nothing about, except that it definitely didn't happen the way that everybody reports that it did. There's really no reason to think he shouldered this stone any more than there is to think that he lifted a horse over his head. That's just where we're at in the game of telephone right now. This is a tall tale. It's no different than Pecos Bill lassoing a tornado. This video is brought to you by Base Strength AI. Some people struggle with the complexity of programming for size and strength, so we took the guesswork out of it. Base Strength AI starts with my programs, 3 proven periodization models to choose from, each one awesome by itself, but now you get complete auto-regulation for exercise selection, volume recommendations, and weight adjustments as you get stronger, which you will. The updates are given set to set, second by second, as you update your workout. Not even an online coach can do that, and this is 1/10 of the price.
A tenth of the price?
Yes, 1/10 of the price. And fuck it, while we're here, I'm gonna double dip. Go to barbellapparel.com, get some Bromley merch, do it for baby Theo. That eye surgery is gonna be expensive. I guess he could just be Bubbles for Halloween every year. Now, another made up stone story was where Louis encountered David Michaud, who, depending on the source, was either Canada's strongest man or the strongest man in the world. And the key here, of course, is that Louis beat him handedly. Every source presents Michaud differently, from reigning Canada's Strongest Man, as if there was a Canada's Strongest Man contest the way there is now, and he was the one that just kept showing up and beating everybody. And then what I think is obviously the most accurate telling, which is saying that he claimed to be Canada's Strongest Man. And at the time, the vaudeville performers, the circus performers, all the strongmen that would go around doing their feats, they would give themselves names, give themselves supernatural origin stories, and they would claim to be the strongest man that ever walked the earth, because if they weren't, why the fuck would anybody buy a ticket to go see them lift some shit?
The strongest man on earth, Mr. Eugene Sandow!
Now, the legend goes, as repeated by Ben Weider and George Jowett and others, that the contest involved one task: picking up the heaviest stone. Whoever lifted the heaviest rock won. And with this one, there's for some reason a 30-kilogram margin of error depending on the source. 480 is the most touted weight, but Ben Weider claimed that it was 522. And in recent years, Peter Benton, a distant relative of Louis Cyr, would give a speech claiming that the stone weighed 458 pounds. Now, Ben Weider and George Jowett were both sycophantic clowns, and they were both integral in perpetuating Cyr's fabricated backstory as being absolute fact. Jowett took immense creative liberty, vividly describing aspects that not only was he not there for, but that mostly didn't happen. For instance, everybody loves the story of Louis' time as a cop. Now, of course, people love to imagine the world's strongest man putting on a badge and going and tossing around criminals like they were 5-year-olds. I mean, Ronnie Coleman didn't do it, and Derek Poundstone didn't do it, but certainly Louis Cyr was out there grabbing grown men by the whiskers and spinning them around and letting them go so they would crash into the crowd, knocking people over like bowling pins. According to Jowett and many other sources, he stopped a knife fight, he was using assailants as human battering rams, and he carried suspects to the police station several at a time. He grabbed each one by the breast of the shirt, which checked them with the same suddenness as if they had charged into a stone wall. Before they could recover the breath that had been knocked out of them, he had thrown them off their feet, face down in the dust of the road, with one huge powerful knee rammed in the small of each back, pinning them down as securely as if they were spiked, while his hands tore the knives out of their hands and hurled them aside into the grass by the road. Badly hurt and exhausted from the contact with this extraordinary human, they were unable to fight back, and their brains seemed to stand still as Cyr tucked one of them under each arm and walked to the police station in that manner and dropped them in a heap before his amazed chief. That night, the Montreal papers were filled with the story, and the news spread all over the country like wildfire. And as Jowett claims, he quit the police force because Strongman was calling him back. He got bored and he needed to pursue Lady Love the Barbell. Now, the problem is that there are 4 newspapers that can be found reporting on this incident from the time that it happened, and not a single one of them mentions any of the sensational aspects of this story. Constable Cyr and Pruel were assaulted in Montreal. It was reported that Constable Pruel was hit on the head with an axe and subsequently died, and that Constable Sear was hit on the temple with a stone and then was struck twice. After being struck, Constable Sear said he thought he was going to die. The truth is, Louis quit because of self-preservation. He thought, fuck this, why am I gonna put my life on the line when I can just go lift shit and get richer than God? Jowett also presented Louis' physical measurements with a little too much positivity, like it got kinda weird. You would hardly think it, but he was the best built big man that ever lived. Look how clean cut his legs are, and remember that his calf measured 28 inches. His legs were majestically terrific, impossible to describe. No wonder they are spoken of as props like the trunk of an oak. Keep in mind that Louis Cyr was 5'8", upwards of 35% body fat, and built like a jelly bean. Yet Jowett would continuously call him the best built man at this weight. 19-inch forearms, 29-inch calves, ridiculous measurements that defy reason. They would look silly if they were on Hafthor Bjornsson's frame, let alone a stocky Canadian manlet like Louis Cyr. Even as Louis tipped the scales at 400 pounds later in his life when he was eating himself to death, extreme edema wouldn't have caused those ridiculous measurements, yet everybody repeats them uncritically as if he was some sort of fucking lard giant. And I'm picking on George Jowett specifically because he isn't just a random fanboy. He is an integral character in the history of strength. He was a legend himself, and he's known as the father of American weightlifting, and he should have known better. These bullshit measurements, along with other bits of fantastical misinformation, were also repeated by Ben Weider, as in Joe Weider's brother, in the book Amazing Canadian, which was yet another tome sucking off the legend of Louis Cyr and presenting what was probably promotional material for his circus act as if it was in fact legitimate historical accounting of what Louis Cyr actually went through. Now, given that these men who are in the know were so eager to shut their brains off and engage in this uncritical ball fondling, it really begs the question as to earlier witnesses who observed Louis' feats and their credibility. Do you really think the lay people in the crowd watching some kid from afar behind the mill who didn't know shit about fuck when it came to lifting were more or less credible than these original strength historians like Jowett and Weider?
You guys not see the problem here?
But we're just getting started. When we consider the culture around Louis' profession as a circus performer, it gets much, much worse. P.T. Barnum, the creator of the Ringling Brothers Circus, is famous for saying a sucker is born every minute, and that's all you need to know about the culture of performance. It's not about fidelity, it's not about telling the truth or being honest. It is about giving the audience a reason to buy a ticket, put their butts in the seat, and that usually involves some exaggerated hyperbolic bullshit. It's important to understand the biggest names of the late 1800s strongman scene were performers themselves. Saxon, Sandow, Cyr. They made their living as performers, and as such, all of their lifts have to be treated with a grain of salt. Consider what Louis' life was like beforehand. The Cyr family, when Louis was 15, mom, dad, 11 kids, end up going to Lowell, Massachusetts from Canada. The area was a textile center, and they ended up there to work, packed into a ghetto with 10,000 other French Canadians. In this insalubrious milieu with its inhumane working conditions, the Cyr family was forced into debt and exposed to the brutal labor regime of the spinning mills. You see, young weightlifting YouTube viewer, when you live in 1800s Canada, where the life expectancy is under 40 years old and you work as a fucking lumberjack, where there's probably a lot of risk and the health insurance probably sucks, and you live with 10 siblings in a ghetto and your parents are laborers who were driven into debt, you're not as likely to have the same unwavering commitment to the honor of Milady Barbell as the average YouTube half-serious Redditor does. Cyr's success as a performer took him from getting swindled out of $25 per week his first time out to earning more than $2,000 per week later in his career. I mean, $2,000 a week is a lot of money right now, and we're dying of inflation, but in today's terms, that's $75,000 a week. And if you think he did it relying on his mere brute strength and impeccable honesty alone, well, I've got some beachfront property in California to sell you. There are beaches in California. Yeah, but California fucking sucks. According to one source that was working really hard to reconcile his obvious embellishment as a performer with his desire to prop him up and preserve his identity as a legend of strength, Cyr was capable of legitimately performing most of what he claimed. However, lifting huge weights 12 hours a day for months at a time is impossible, even for someone as strong as Louis Cyr. Therefore, it was necessary to fake his lifts occasionally. Usually strongmen accomplish this by lifting weights labeled with higher figures than they really were. Note that the author has absolutely no way of knowing if his lifts were bullshit or not, which ones were bullshit, and even says lifting most of what he claimed, leaving the possibility open that he couldn't lift everything that he claimed. Knowing where these lines were, your guess is as good as mine, but at this point it's pretty foolish to assume that his biggest numbers were obviously what they claimed to be. From an interview of an unknown strongman with Alan Calvert, "You are perfectly capable of handling the amount of weight you claim, so why do you only handle a third of that weight?" The reply, What's the use? I make the people think I'm working. They would believe I lifted 480 if I said so. What's the sense of lifting 240 if I can get by with 80? Now this brings us to the argument. Well, they could lift that weight. They were just fibbing for longevity and so that they could perform more often. This involves believing that the performers had some code of honesty, like they would fib to eke out more performances, but they absolutely wouldn't fib to make the audience think they were stronger than they actually were, which is of course fucking stupid. Now to give further context to the culture of vaudeville performers, here's some other shady characters that gave a sense of the actual integrity that abounded in the era. For instance, there's Arthur Saxon, part of the Saxon Trio, which was a circus troupe. He was a performer to the core, claimed to have done a 370 bent press and later on a 400 that Thomas Inch, a friend of his and a reputable source, the namesake of the Inch dumbbell, said, yeah, no, that definitely didn't happen. Thomas Inch specifically said that it was not weighed, it was not verified, but even today that lift pops up with the word official next to it. And this is Exhibit A for why the word official doesn't mean dick when it comes to any lifts performed by circus performers in the 1800s. Father of modern bodybuilding, Eugene Sandow sued Arthur Saxon after losing to him in a bent press contest. He had alleged that Saxon fucked with the weights, that he filled it with mercury, and that now Saxon was going around, I'm the man that beat Sandow, and raking in all kinds of money while slandering Sandow's reputation. Now the thing is, in the lawsuit, former Saxon Trio member actually testified on behalf of Sandow that yes, actually bullshit occurred, and the courts ended up siding with Sandow. Now, was Sandow crazy? Was he just a poor sport? Was he paranoid? Why would he have reason to think these noble lifters of yesteryear would ever risk tarnishing their perfect reputation and desecrating the spirit of sport? The reason is because they weren't fucking sportsmen. They were performers and they did it all the time. That brings us to these three main characters. I'm telling you, these guys are like the Three Stooges if they lifted fake weights and posted it on Instagram. You have Samson, Cyclops, and Sandow with an E. Yes, Sandow with an E. I told you these guys are egregious. This is like when you walk by the $5 bin at Walmart, you see out of the corner of your eye the movie that looks like it's the most recent Fast and Furious movie, and you don't know that it's not until you already buy it, get home, put it in the DVD player. Now Samson was like the head honcho. He had a backstory where he was like a sickly boy until he got struck by lightning and then just became strong as shit. And he would routinely issue challenges to people in the audience to come up and lift his weights to verify that they were absolutely as heavy as he claimed they were. Now Samson made assurances that nobody would lift the weights, and we know this because he got caught like all the fucking time. In one situation, two men jumped on stage to show the barrels that he was about to lift were being drained after the audience members would come up to test them, and he was lifting empty barrels. In another situation, weights would be clipped to the floor, and his lackey, Cyclops, would be pretending to buff the weights while he would unclip them after the testing phase. Probably the best story involves Samson's pet lift, the harness lift, where he tried to lift an elephant, and in trying to do so, he ended up blacking out and falling, revealing the entire platform to be rigged. Now the team of Samson and Cyclops, with their shining reputation, would eventually have to recruit other lifters to accept their challenges so that they actually had a show to begin with, and they stumbled across Montgomery Irving, who would later become the false Sandow, Sandow with an E, who offered to play ball and even throw the match for a set price. So what, you say, there's always unscrupulous players. That doesn't incriminate my boy Sandow, certainly not my boy Louis Cyr. Well, I hate to break it to you, Cupcake, but those characters, those professional villains, were regulars on the strongman scene, and they would even perform alongside and collude with some of your favorite saints of strength, including Louis Cyr. See, Cyclops and fake Sandow would eventually branch out, doing their own thing away from Samson. And the story is that Louis caught wind of their regular shit talking. In their performances, they were constantly calling out Louis because, of course, when you're a completely fake sham of a lifter, why wouldn't you call out the person who is supposedly the strongest man in all of the world? Of course you would do that. Apparently Louis caught wind, said fuck that, abandoned another engagement that he was on to race back to challenge them on the stage exactly when they were going up. And then he stuck around to do it the next night. That's what you call a double feature. It's a repeat performance. And of course he would do that because he was getting a cut of the box office, and coming back a second night would ensure that word would spread, more people would buy tickets, and Louis would get a bigger cut. Louis showing up for free just to put these guys in their place when he was making $2,000 a fucking week on performances is like Floyd Mayweather showing up to a stage boxing match just to check somebody who is talking shit. It doesn't fucking work that way. Now there's another hole in this because Cyclops was actually supposedly capable of a trick that Louis Cyr could not replicate, breaking coins in between his fingers. And the thing is, Cyclops opted not to pull that trick out, which doesn't make any sense, because if he legitimately was capable of doing that, Of course he would do that, but even if he wasn't, the stage would have been set for them and he would have had his bullshit coins available anyways. And that points to the logical conclusion, which is that Louis Cyr didn't need to be of godlike strength to live his days undefeated and be the most successful strongman promoter of the day. He just needed to be the biggest draw, which he was, and he just needed to be really good at negotiating collaboration. See, Cyclops and Sandow with an E were professional villains. The only logical reason that Louis Cyr would show up multiple times to perform on their stage free of any events that might challenge his perfect reputations would be if it was a paid performance and the outcome was decided ahead of time. Even today, Louis Cyr has a reputation for having taken on and beaten all comers, and while technically he's undefeated, it's not quite right. He beat everyone he faced, but there's no reason to believe any one of them was a fair contest that was done on the fly rather than a pure scripted performance. When Louis Cyr was overseas, he was apparently on Sandow's nuts, calling him out left and right and offering cash prizes and using his name to bolster his own. But nothing ended up coming of it. Now, Sandow was like half the fucking size of Cyr. This is like Thor calling out John Hack. Like, even if John Hack's insane strength somehow levels the playing field, it still looks like a bitch move. But to Cyr, tiny Sandow was A, a sure thing, but also B, a much bigger draw, so it made sense to call him out. While overseas, Cyr did not issue a similar challenge to the 6 foot 3 inch, 265 pound French giant, Apollon, real name Louis Uni, who is nearly his same age, nor would Apollon challenge Cyr. The two greatest strongmen of their day apparently decided to leave each other at arm's length. Again, these are not vicious competitors in it for the love of sport. These are performers whose high income hinged on their untarnished reputations. Now, more egregious than Cyr colluding with Cyclops and fake Sandow, or in sidestepping actual competition in the form of Apollon, was his very last show, which was so flagrant that the boos from the audience were actually recorded in the newspapers. See, at the end of his career, Cyr was dying of kidney failure. He ended up paralyzed for a time and gained something like 100 pounds. He was close to the 400-pound mark. Now, miraculously, somehow he recovered just enough to eke out one last performance. Now, let's forget about the absolute nonsense of the idea that Cyr, in that paralyzed state, wasting away, would have had anything that looked like a competitive package. Let's just look at the actual reporting of the event. The contest was marked by each man getting a point for their token lift. You could say that Louis was weak, so he decided to pass on events that he didn't think he would do well in, like when Descaries did a side press with 171 and Louis refused to match it despite getting credit for 100 pounds more earlier in his career. But Descaries was actually doing the same thing, to the point where they ended up tying. Now, the decision meant that Louis actually hadn't lost. He retained his title. But then it gets really weird when Louis gives this speech. Hector Descaries is perhaps the strongest man I have ever met in all of my years in the arena. It gives me such deep pleasure to recognize him as my successor to the title of strongest man in the world and my championship belt. It was nothing more than a fucking publicity stunt to bolster Descaries' career. Louis would get paid for one last performance where he got to retain his perfect untarnished reputation, but Descaries would get the benefit of getting the nod from the Legend of Strength. And I'm sure Louis got paid a handsome sum for that. It's as phony as it gets, and it was just one piece of evidence out of a mountain of evidence that prevents anybody from making any strong conclusions about Louis Cyr's actual physical abilities. Okay, so he was a performer and he fibbed a lot and there was some rigging that went on, but what about the actual lifts? He beat a lot of people, he got credit for really big lifts, so let's get to those. One of Louis' most often repeated record is a backlift where he lifted 18 men on a platform that exceeded 4,300 pounds. Now we know this is bullshit because a specific number was given to the record as you would need for a record, but it's worth noting that it absolutely was not common to weigh the individual participants who would stand on the platform of a backlift. So when there was a specific weight given to it, it was ballparked. And this was confirmed later by Warren Lincoln Travis, who said years later that when he asked Louis Cyr if the men had been individually weighed, he said they had not. But there's that word official again, right next to a bullshit lift. Now in that era, backlifts would be a no-brainer because it allows the most absolute amount of weight to be lifted and it looks impressive to the point of absolute disbelief. But it's not unbelievable. See, human beings are capable of carrying immense amounts of weight upright. At the Arnold Classic, the bale tote would get over 1,500 pounds, and that means that these athletes are supporting completely upright 1,500 pounds on one leg while moving it down a platform. Now, if you put them on all fours, they have more limbs, more structure, more stability, and the weight can get absolutely insane. Given the fact that this is a niche lift that nobody fucking does anymore, and that Louis played fast and loose with his record numbers, you would expect his record to just be light years ahead of of everybody, but Paul Anderson was said to have done over 6,000 pounds. And in the 90s, we have Guinness verifying a lift and video evidence of a 5,000 plus backlift, which blows Louis out of the water. Embellishments aside, Louis probably did backlift thousands of pounds, but so did a lot of people. So we need a little bit more to say this is one of the strongest men that ever lived. Another popular feat of his is resisting horses. Apparently in front of a crowd, he had 2 horses hooked to either arm, trying to pull his arms apart, and they were unable. Now, this actually requires a lot less strength than you would intuit. People like to watch this because it implies that Louis is stronger than 4 horses, which of course he isn't. Many strongmen have done this against automobiles, motorcycles, and the like. And even in Thomas Inch's book, Strength Secrets, he tells people who are starting out to begin with several people on each side and then work up to a dozen. I have no idea what the conversion units are for standardizing this lift so we can compare them to other people. I'm sure you need to be strong to do this, but this is firmly in parlor trick territory where people will assign you godlike strength once they witness it, even though anything but is required in order to pull it off. Then we have Louis' one finger lifts. Speaking of niche lifts, 533 pounds is what he got credited with. Now the problem here is that Tom Stensness, known as The Finger, actually got credit for going over 600 pounds. In addition to that, back in Louis' day, Hans Stryver was purporting numbers close to this while doing a front hold with a kettlebell and basically doing the splits on 2 fucking chairs. Now you can second guess these lifts. You could say that Hans was full of shit and he was just another imposter playing off of Louis' success, but then you have to give a case why I should believe that the most successful strongman performer of the era wasn't full of shit. And even if both were legit, it's still not a world record. It's since been beaten. Now we're gonna end on an optimistic note for Louis because I do believe the man was a strong presser for his time anyways. His supposed 340-pound 2-arm barbell clean and press is within the realm of reason. Even if we assume that it was as strict as a coked up Catholic nun, a man in the 300-pound range doing a 340 press, it's not mind-blowing. Strong, but not mind-blowing. And you need to exceed mind-blowing to get the crown of strongest man that ever lived. Now Louis' 273 one-arm press is a bit more exceptional. You've seen this picture of him. If it looks fake, it's because it was fake. It took a long time to capture a photograph. You had to pose still. So of course they're not gonna have him hold a 270-pound dumbbell for the minutes that it would take for the film to process. His press was a side press, kind of a baby brother to a bent press, which would be preferred with people that had Louis' mobility limitations. We have a video of Paul Anderson demonstrating the same thing, supposedly on the order of 300 pounds. Note the difference, the leverages are better. You're pressing yourself away as you press the weight up, and this is just a much stronger position. Paul Anderson certainly could not strict press 600 pounds, but he's making this weight seem relatively easy. The way the feat's reported gives the impression that Louis Cyr was doing a strict standing 1-arm dumbbell press. They even showed it that way in his movie. This is absolutely not how he executed the press. It's completely inaccurate. And when you insert the actual technique that was used, it comes back down to the realm of the mundane. Now, I don't trust the advertised weight on any of Cyr's lifts, but even if he did side press 273 pounds, whoop-de-doo. We have people today going in excess of 330 pounds. So again, probably not legit, but even if it is legit, not even anywhere near where you would need to be to solidify your legacy as the strongest man who ever lived. So that's the long and short of Louis Cyr. He was a guy that was kind of big, kind of strong, realized that he didn't have to risk his life working as a police officer, so he went and became one of the most successful performers in history, got richer than God, and then ate himself to death. His showmanship was so good that it solidified a lot of the made-up marketing bullshit of his performance into his actual legacy. Was he strong? Of course he was fucking strong. But I can say conclusively that Louis Cyr's legacy as a strongman is entirely embellished, hyperbolic, and overrated. So that's your daily serving of Haterade, folks. Let me know what you think in the comments. Until next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.